I already made a video a few years ago on the topic of composing a canon against a Cantus Firmus, and this video is going to be a sort of a correction or improvement, hopefully, on that one. The only resources I consulted for that video came from the 19th and 20th centuries, which is usually good enough for a tutorial video on YouTube. But the authors that I researched did not really know how to compose these kinds of exercises beyond a trial and error approach. Ebenezer Prout was a pretty important counterpoint authority from that time, and he had this to say about composing a canon in accompaniment of a pre-composed Cantus Firmus. It will often happen that either the interval or the distance of time of the reply will be such that it will be quite impossible to continue the canon. In that case, a fresh attempt must be made at some other interval or some other distance until success rewards our efforts. And elsewhere, the student must also be prepared for many disappointments. At first, indeed, he will probably have at least 2 or 3 failures to every success. I have to admit that this guess and check attitude was good enough for me, but it was not good enough for Julien Constantino 3592, who asked, "Isn't there mathematical equations we could use to make it faster?" This comment got under my skin, and it turns out that, yes, there is a systematic method for composing canons against a Cantus Firmus using Sergei Taneev's mathematical approach. This video is going to rely heavily on the terminology and math from earlier videos in the Movable Counterpoint playlist, so if you're jumping into this video midstream, you may want to watch those videos first. I recently published an open access research article on this topic, so I'll link to that in the description for anyone who wants a deeper dive. I also would have been better prepared to make the previous video if I had consulted earlier sources from the Renaissance. Early Music Sources put out a video last spring that gives a fascinating overview of the approach that was developed in the 16th century that is based on tables of fixed consonances, and I can highly recommend that video for those who want to discover more about how this problem was dealt with historically, and of course the table-based approach is still viable today. The approach that I recommend in my article consists of 7 steps. First, choose the parameters of the canonic exercise. Here is a sample setup. I've placed Fuchs's Dorian Cantus Firmus in the middle voice in the alto range. The bass is the proposta, or the leading voice of the canon, and the soprano is the risposta, or the following voice. Now that the roles have been distributed, we can be more specific about the type of canon we are going to compose. The risposta follows the proposta at an interval of entrance of a 12th upward, and will also follow at a distance of entrance of 1 measure. I penciled in the notes D and A for the first notes of the bass and soprano, but here in step 1, these are just placeholders. We can always change them if we need to later. The basic problem of how to guarantee that both the proposta and risposta form correct counterpoint with the Cantus Firmus can be framed in terms of Taneev's theory of movable counterpoint. The proposta and Cantus Firmus can be thought of as an original 2-voice combination, and the risposta and Cantus Firmus can be thought of as a derivative combination brought about by double shifting counterpoint applied to the original. The interval of entrance of the canon will determine the vertical shift index, and the distance of entrance will determine the horizontal shift index. In this case, JV equals -11. The value is negative because we are transposing the notes of the proposta in the direction of the Cantus Firmus, which decreases the harmonic intervals between them. And it is 11 because we transpose by 11 steps of the diatonic scale. Similarly, shifting the notes of the proposta 1 measure to the right implies JH equals 1. These numbers, by the way, aren't actually going to be used in the composition process. They're just a way to name the type of double shifting counterpoint. For instance, when we are analyzing a canon that was written against a Cantus Firmus in real repertoire, like in Bach's Goldberg variations, it's nice to be able to specify the exact kind of double shifting counterpoint. Step 2 is to find the placement of the imaginary Cantus Firmus. We're going to use an imaginary voice to create a basic version to help solve the problem of the double shifting counterpoint. In this case, the imaginary voice will be a copy of the Cantus Firmus. To do this, we transpose the notes of the Cantus Firmus down a 12th instead of upward, and to the left one measure instead of to the right. The first note of the Cantus Firmus would correspond with the note of the imaginary Cantus Firmus that begins before the exercise, so it's not written in. The two copies of our given melody now form a canon that has the same parameters as the one we are trying to compose, but the imaginary Cantus Firmus plays the role of the proposta, and the actual Cantus Firmus plays the role of the risposta. It does not matter that this canon forms bad counterpoint. So for instance, notice the unprepared and unresolved dissonant ninth in measure 4. All that matters is that we now know the constraints that these two given melodies will place on our proposta voice. For reasons that we discussed in the previous video of the series, the harmonic interval that is formed between the imaginary Cantus Firmus and the Cantus Firmus, what I like to call the guide interval, that is the vertical shift index that governs the type of counterpoint for the proposta in each measure. After completing step 2 of the working method, we can tell, for instance, that measures 1 and 6 need to be composed according to the rules of invertible counterpoint at the 10th, while most of the rest of the exercise will be composed in invertible counterpoint at the 13th. Measure 4 will be the only tricky spot, where we will need to compose in invertible counterpoint at the 9th. In general, the exercise will be easiest if there's a preponderance of consonant guide intervals, such as octaves, tenths, and twelfths, which allow for the textbook kinds of invertible counterpoint, and especially unisons, which allow for simple counterpoint. But some vertical shifts are more difficult than others. The canonic parameters of our exercise become more difficult as the number of dissonant guide intervals increases, especially parallel dissonances. Taneev shows this diagram to explain this point. If the guide intervals move in parallel seconds, the counterpoint melody can only form a fifth with one of the voices and a sixth with the other. But if that is the case, how can the counterpoint melody continue without forming parallel fifths with one of the voices? Taneev manages to get the counter melody to last a little while longer with guide intervals of parallel sevenths, but this also eventually reaches an impasse. This is the kind of problem that Ebenezer Prout and his students encountered, but back then they had no way of predicting when these thorny patches would pop up. If you notice parallel seconds, sevenths, or ninths in the guide intervals after you finish step 2 of the working method, you know that the parameters that you chose in step 1 will not produce an effective canon, and you should start over. In fact, you may want to work backwards, shifting the imaginary Cantus Firmus around in your mind until you find a canon with the Cantus Firmus that produces good guide intervals. Then use those parameters for your canonic voices. Step 3 is to compose notes for the proposta voice, making sure to form correct counterpoint in combination with the Cantus Firmus and, independently, with the imaginary Cantus Firmus. In measure 1, for instance, we can select the note D for the proposta, which forms an octave below the Cantus Firmus and third above the imaginary Cantus Firmus. We can use Taneev's equation from the video on vertical shifting counterpoint, n equals m plus jv, to verify that our guide intervals really are indicating the correct vertical shift index. As a reminder, in this equation, m is a harmonic interval of the original combination, and n is the corresponding interval of the derivative. In this case, the octave between proposta and Cantus Firmus is 7 steps. 7 plus -9 is -2, and indeed, the derivative interval of the risposta in measure 2 is a third, or 2 steps, above the Cantus Firmus. It is not a coincidence that this interval is a third. The counterpoint of risposta and Cantus Firmus is simply a transposed copy of whatever counterpoint the proposta formed in relation to the imaginary cantus firmus. Keep in mind that we may need to add some musica ficta every once in a while, in the form of B flats or F sharps, to avoid some voice leading errors in the derivative. Step 4 is to copy out the notes of the risposta, transposed from the proposta by the interval and distance of entrance of our canon. Our main goal is to compose a fluent melody for the proposta that forms correct counterpoint with the cantus firmus and imaginary cantus firmus. But we need to actually write out the notes of the risposta as we go, since we are committed to those notes based on earlier decisions, and we need to consider the three-voice counterpoint between proposta, risposta, and cantus firmus. Step 5 is very similar to step 3. Here we are going to compose notes for the proposta, forming correct counterpoint with the cantus firmus, imaginary cantus firmus, and whatever notes of the risposta we have already composed. In measure 2, for instance, we need a note for the bass voice that forms consonances above the imaginary cantus firmus note A, as well as below the cantus firmus note F and the risposta note A. So we are triply constrained in this measure. It would also be nice to compose a complete triad, so the note D in the bass seems like a desirable solution. This note D forms a fourth above the imaginary cantus firmus, which would normally be considered a dissonant interval in two-voice counterpoint. However, in this case, it may be treated as an imperfect consonance because the derivative combination occurs between upper parts. However, in order to justify the fourth between upper voices in measure 3, we need to give those notes consonant bass support. In this case, that support can come either from the note A, forming an incomplete 8-5 chord, or preferably C, forming a complete 6-3 chord. A does not work, since it forms a dissonant second with the imaginary cantus firmus note G, so we can go ahead with the note C for the bass in measure 3. This produces another fourth between upper parts in measure 4. And this puts us in a slightly tricky spot, since now we need to justify the fourth while at the same time dealing with the difficult vertical shift index of -8, invertible counterpoint at the 9th. If you want to try your hand at a solution, you can pause the video before I reveal what I came up with. In my solution, I actually went back and changed the previous measure slightly in order to get what I wanted in measure 4. I wanted to use the note F in the proposta in measure 4, which would form a sixth in the original combination that would invert into a fourth between upper parts in the derivative of measure 5. But this would not form a chord with the previously chosen note G for the risposta in measure 4. So I went back and altered the proposta in measure 3. Now, instead of a whole note C, I tied the note D for measure 2 over the downbeat as a dissonant suspension that resolves downward to C sharp on the third beat of the measure. The note B on beat 2 is a decoration of the resolution. This configuration of notes changes meaning in the risposta in measure 4, where now the downbeat interval is a perfect fifth above the cantus firmus, which is a consonance. The leap to F on beat 2 is an arpeggiation through the D minor triad, and G on beat 3 now behaves as a dissonant passing tone. This is a complicated solution that exploits what Taneev calls variable intervals, but like I said, measure 4 was going to be a tricky spot no matter what we did. Step 6 is to repeat steps 3, 4, and 5 until the exercise is completed with a skeleton or framework. Keep in mind especially that the strict imitation of the proposta and risposta is likely going to need to be relaxed as we approach the cadence. Also keep in mind that we do not need to work chronologically from left to right through the exercise. It might be a clever idea to come up with a good solution for the thorny areas of an exercise, such as measure 4 in this example, and then work outward from there. If you need to, you can write out interval tables showing how the intervals of the original combination will transform into intervals of the derivative based on the vertical shift indices. Finally, step 7 is to elaborate the framework with faster note values. These elaborations can be used to improve the basic framework in at least 4 different ways. First, they can be used to correct errors in the whole note framework. Notice, for example, how what was a leap of a diminished fifth in the Topmost Voice between measures 5 and 6 has been filled in with stepwise motion, although we are still outlining a dissonant interval. Second, they allow for injecting more dissonance into the voice leading, as with the suspensions near the end of the exercise. Third, these elaborations can serve to give the impression of a more filled-out harmony. For instance, measure 6 previously contained only an incomplete 8-5 chord in the whole note framework, the notes B-flat and F. But now, quarter note passing tones allow us to include the chordal third, D, on beat 3 of the measure. Lastly, faster note values allow us to balance out the composite rhythm of the exercise and create a rhythmic arc. Notice how, overall, the exercise begins with a mainly half-note pulse that quickens to quarter note motion near the middle of the exercise before slowing down again near the cadence. This is what the completed exercise sounds like. Composing an exercise with the Cantus Firmus in a different position creates no new difficulties. In this exercise, I placed the Cantus Firmus in the bass voice. The alto is the proposta, and the soprano follows as risposta at the upper fifth at a distance of 1 measure. The imaginary Cantus Firmus is therefore a copy of the Cantus Firmus transposed down a perfect fifth and shifted 1 measure earlier. The only thing to keep in mind when the Cantus Firmus is in an outer voice is that the vertical shift indices of each measure are likely to be positive instead of negative. This means that we will be composing with what Taneev refers to as direct shifting counterpoint rather than invertible counterpoint. Returning to our equation n equals m plus jv, we can see that the octave of the original combination in measure 1 means that m equals 7, plus the positive vertical shift index of 2 equals positive 9 for the derivative. This is the only basic difference. It changes the math slightly, but this type of exercise is no more difficult than the one shown earlier. Here's what this exercise sounds like. And for the sake of being complete, here's a canon written with the Cantus Firmus in the topmost voice. Just like with the Cantus Firmus in the lowest voice, this exercise features positive values for the vertical shift index and direct shifting counterpoint. Let's return briefly to the canon that I composed back in 2021. Now, I did the best that I could, but it has several imperfections that could not have been avoided without a better understanding of the mechanics of this type of exercise. For example, there are prolonged dominant seventh chords that would not be permitted in strict counterpoint. There is a bad hidden fifth and a hidden octave in the next measure. And lastly, there is a fifth moving to a 12th, a so-called anti-parallel fifth. I thought that these compromises were defensible because of the difficulty of the exercise. If I had known how to determine the imaginary Cantus Firmus, I would have noticed that there are consecutive sevenths in the guide intervals. This takes the guesswork completely out of the exercise, and I would likely have chosen to compose an easier canon as a demonstration. Finally, in an academic article where I originally wrote these ideas out, authors are expected to not speculate, but to keep to the facts. YouTube has no such policy. I think that the Renaissance authors who discussed these types of canons, such as Lusitano, Zarlino, and especially Morley, I think they knew about the technique of imaginary voices and how they could be used in composing this type of canon. None of these authors, as far as I have discovered, ever explicitly recommend to the reader that they should memorize the lists of fixed consonances that they enumerate in their texts, and that William Bath presented as a table. Instead, they just list the intervals. It strikes me as almost superhuman to memorize such a list and then use that information to not just compose, but improvise a canon against a Cantus Firmus, which is apparently what some of these musicians were able to do in the 16th century. Also, these authors left many examples of advanced canons written against a Cantus Firmus, including canons in contrary motion, rhythmic augmentation and diminution, and retrograde motion. A list or table of fixed consonances cannot lead you to the composition of these kinds of advanced canons. However, an imaginary Cantus Firmus can be used in this way, which is something I demonstrate in the article. Again, this is speculation, but Taneev himself believed something similar. Discussing an example of horizontal shifting counterpoint by Antonio Berardi, he writes that, quote, "The writer could not have been unacquainted with the methods that yield such combinations." And later, "No doubt this is an illustration of a fact often mentioned in music histories, that the old contrapuntists kept their knowledge secret, passing it on to the elect only verbally." Understanding how imaginary voices can be used would have been a very powerful compositional tool, and I do not find it implausible that such knowledge might have been treated as a trade secret, not fit to be put in print. That knowledge was passed on esoterically, perhaps in musicians' guilds and societies, and it might have been lost sometime between the generations of J.S. Bach, who I think clearly understood it, and Ebenezer Prout, who claims not to know any systematic solution to the problems that we looked at in this video. But I would be interested to know your thoughts in the comments. I hope to make one more video this summer about Taneev's posthumous sequel to his first book, teaching how to compose 3- and 4-voice finite and infinite canons. So keep an eye out for that one. Bye for now.